go ahead and get started, and Rachel, you can continue letting everyone in as they come into the weight room. But welcome everyone who's joining us. My name is Shannon Stott. I'm the Training and Development Manager in the Office of Human Resources. I also co-chair the Identifying and Dismantling Racial Injustice Training and Education Committee, alongside of my colleague Simone Beckford, who is also on this call today. I wanted to take a minute and acknowledge Dr. Virginia Glazer, as well as Dr. Rachel Rossi, for their dedication on this work on the faculty subcommittee, because without them in teamwork, these workshops would not be possible. So we really appreciate everybody's dedication. So today's workshop is going to be facilitated by Dr. Angel Jones, and it will focus on the importance of incorporating anti-racist pedagogy in the classroom. Dr. Angel Jones is a passionate educator with over 15 years of experience in K-12 and higher education. As both an educator and a researcher, she strives to improve the lives of marginalized students while providing opportunities for their stories to be told. Her research focuses on the experience of Black and Brown students at historically white institutions, and more specifically, she examines how their experiences impact their mental health and overall well-being. Some of Dr. Jones' her research also, some of Dr. Jones' specific areas of interest include microaggressions, racial battle fatigue, gendered racism, and the psychological impact of each of them on the students of color. Additionally, her research is informed by critical race theory, critical race feminism, and other frameworks that acknowledge and highlight the impact of race, gender, and other marginalized identities on the experiences of students of color. So Dr. Jones is a Brooklyn native who has received her PhD from George Washington University, which focuses on inequality in higher education. Additionally, she has an MED and an Ed.S. in school counseling from Georgia State University, as well as a BA in political science from Syracuse University. That's my hometown, Dr. Jones. I'm 20 minutes away where my family is, so 315. So with that, I'm happy to introduce and hand it over to Dr. Jones. And Dr. Jones, we thank you so much for being here today. And those are quite the credentials, so we can't wait to be part of this training.
Thank you for that. Just hearing 315 makes me cold. Can I tell you, I do not miss upstate New York. I do not miss Syracuse snowstorms at all. But hey, y'all, it is so nice to be here. Like she said, I am Angel Jones. My pronouns are she, her, and Aya. I'm super excited to have this conversation with you. I'm going to share my screen and jump right in. So as most of y'all know, this is going to be a two-part series. So today I will be focusing on what the impacts of racial microaggressions and racial battle fatigue are on the mental health of students of color. And then for the next part, which I believe is in 2 weeks, I will be talking about how to actually implement anti-racist practices into your teaching to help deal with some of these consequences that we will talk about today. I am super informal, so I don't like to talk at people. I don't lecture because I think that that's boring. So I will be sharing information with you. You're welcome to wait to the end to ask questions, but if there's ever any time in between slides or between me saying something that you want to stop and make a comment or ask a question, please feel free to do so. I also encourage you to engage with one another in the chat box as well. I know virtual isn't as personal as we'd like to be, but I'd like this to be as conversational as possible. So just a quick overview of what I intend our time to look like today. Like I said, this is really about y'all. So this is what I'm planning to talk about, but if there's something else that you think would be more helpful, please stop me and ask. So I'll start by going over microaggressions, both what they are, some examples, and what the negative psychological effects of them are. Then I'll go into what racial battle fatigue is. Then I'll talk about a research study that I did that specifically looks at how Black graduate women respond to and cope with gendered racial microaggressions. From there, I'll share a counter story about their experiences, and I'll explain what a counter story is for those of you who are unfamiliar with critical race theory or counter storytelling. I'll share some recommendations, because even though next week is focused on the next session is focused on practices, I still want to at least leave y'all with something to take away today, and then answer any questions that y'all have at the end. But like I said before, feel free to stop me at any time. Okay, so what are microaggressions? So microaggressions are a term that was coined by psychiatrist Chester Pierce back in 1960, and it refers to these subtle everyday insights or slights or mistreatments that are directly targeted towards people because of their race. A couple of things to keep in mind when you're thinking about racial microaggressions is one, that they can be verbal or nonverbal. An example of a verbal microaggression could be something like, which I have heard, oh, she's really smart for a Black girl. And a nonverbal microaggression, which happens often as well, is when a white woman is walking down the street and sees a Black man and either clutches her purse or chooses to cross the street. She may not have verbally said anything, but her actions communicate that she perceives him as a threat, which is predominantly based on the fact that he is a Black man. So they can be both verbal or nonverbal, but after this, I'll give you some more specific examples of what microaggressions look like. They can also be unintentional or intentional. So oftentimes people aren't even aware of the fact that they are microaggressing people, which is why workshops like these are really important in being able to show people specific examples, because, you know, there's the whole intent versus impact, right? So you might not intend to say something or do something, but that doesn't take away from the impact or the psychological consequences that our students are experiencing because of our actions. So we need to make sure that we're very aware of what it is we're doing and how it's impacting our students. And then also want to make sure that we're understanding that although they're called microaggressions, micro does not mean that their impact is insignificant. They're called micro because it's talking about an isolated incident, but their impact by no means is meant to be thought of as micro or insignificant in any way. Any questions or comments about that so far? I can never see the chat when I'm doing this part, so feel free to yell at me and let me know, okay? Rachel, I'm just going to look at your face and you can let me know if there's something that I'm supposed to do. Okay, thank you. Okay, so some examples of microaggressions. So this is a comic strip that I use with my students when I'm teaching them microaggressions. So when I'm teaching educators, I like to do things that are obviously going to educate y'all, but I also believe in providing tools that you can then use with your students. So I'm happy to share this entire comic strip with y'all. It talks about various kinds of microaggressions, not just racial microaggressions, but based on our conversation, I only pulled out the strips that pertain to that. So if you want that resource, I'm happy to share that with you. So this one right here, it is a woman of color, and as she's starting out her day, she is excited. She's making herself feel good. She's telling herself that she looks really good. Then we see this first slide on the right. Immediately as her day starts, she's experiencing microaggression, which many people of color, especially me, being a Brooklyn girl, I know what it's like to be on the corner in Manhattan and try to hail a cab, but we're not able to because of the way we look. Or I've had people, or if a cab will stop, but I tell them that I live in Brooklyn, they will literally keep driving and will not pick me up. So just certain things that we have to deal with. So this is just an example of what she's doing. So they haven't said anything to her or done anything specific, but their behavior lets her know that, okay, they're not stopping for me because I am a person of color. As her day continues, so she wasn't able to get a cab, so now she's on the train. I cannot tell you how many times I have been on a bus or train and there is a white person next to me and they will scooch over as much as they can to not have to touch me or be near me. One time someone actually fell off of her chair because she was trying so hard not to touch me. Or there have been times where there's an empty seat next to me and no one will sit next to me at all, and they'd rather stand. In studies that I have done, I did a study with undergraduate students at George Washington University, and what one of them said that when she takes the school circular line bus thing, that happens to her all the time, where white students will either just stand or they'll scooch as far away from her as possible. So that's what's happening here on the left. On this right one, there's this assumption, this exotification of women of color. So he assumes because her name isn't what he would assume is a typical name that she has to be from some exotic place. And she's like, no, I'm from Brooklyn. This next one, so she is being interrupted by her coworkers. My work looks at gendered racial microaggressions as well, which are microaggressions that don't just attack Black women for being Black, but specifically for being Black women. And one of the many ways that we experience that is being disrespected in the workplace. So either being purposely silenced or having people talk over us or interrupt us or things like that. And that is what's happening to her here. Another thing that happens if you look to what she says on the left versus the right, she says the same thing that the man says, but no one listens until the man says it, right? And that is something that happens to women in general, but definitely happens to Black women. And then if you've noticed, size-wise, she is shrinking as the day goes on because she's continuing to have to deal with microaggression after microaggression. And this next one, the same thing is happening to her again on the train, now with a different person. This one on the right, the salesperson says, just so you know, we don't take food stamps. So there's this assumption that just because she is a person of color, that she would be paying that way. I know for some people, these might seem atypical. They're actually not. I remember when I was in undergrad at Syracuse, I was a political science major, which is a major that's typically predominantly white men. And I remember going into class the first day and a white man said, "Oh, African American studies is next door." And I was like, no, I'm in the right place. Right? But this assumption that people have about people of color when they see us, and then what they're saying and doing as a result of those negative assumptions or biases. In this last one, she's literally like, all she's trying to do is get home after a day of microaggressions, and she can't even get the key into the door without being harassed by a cop who assumes that, so because someone like her, because she looks the way she looks, she can't possibly live where she lives. And I know plenty of friends who have been harassed by people in their own neighborhood by assuming that. As a professor now at GW, I have been questioned when going into the building where I teach as a professor. When I was a PhD student, I used to get questioned all the time. I got chased one day as I was going into the building because people didn't, I guess the woman didn't think I belonged there, but when she saw me use my ID to get into the building, she stopped following me. So just kind of what that is like for us on a regular basis. And then if you see here on the right, just how small she is at the end of the day because of all of these things that she has had to deal with. And you remember in the beginning, like she was super excited for the day and she was like, yes, you're amazing. You're going to kick butt today. It's going to be great. And while each individual incident might be perceived as small to those who are on the outside, when you're constantly having to deal with them left and right, it really has a negative effect on you mentally, emotionally, psychologically. Okay. Questions or comments about that? So like I said, so this one has probably about 10 different strips, and it also talks about gender specific microaggressions. There's some about weight and things like that. So I'm happy to share the entire resources if any of y'all want to use it in your classrooms. So I'm gonna talk about some specific effects based on what the research shows us. So experiencing racial microaggression leads to decreased self-esteem. Which makes sense, right? Because if someone is constantly questioning you and your abilities, you're going to start to question yourself as well. It leads to anxiety. I know for myself, there are times when I was a PhD student where I didn't want to go to class on certain days if I knew we were going to be talking about race, because I didn't know how the conversation was going to turn out. I didn't know if the professor was going to step in, if someone said something inappropriate, like just this constant anxiety of not knowing what was going to happen that day. Because when you get so used to dealing with microaggressions on a regular basis, it's not a will it happen, it's going to be a when will it happen, and just having to deal with that constant anxiety of that, having depressive thoughts as a result of that as well, PTSD, and suicidal thoughts. So all of these are based on a number of research studies that have shown that students that experience racial microaggressions are dealing with these negative psychological consequences. Dealing with them on a consistent, prolonged basis leads to what is known as racial battle fatigue. And racial battle fatigue is a term that was coined by Dr. William A. Smith, who was a professor out of the University of Utah. And basically what racial battle fatigue talks about, it addresses both the psychological and physiological consequences of experiencing racial microaggressions on a consistent, prolonged basis. So some of the psychological effects we just talked about, so the depression, anxiety, suicidal thoughts. Additional ones include nightmares, anger, frustration, hypervigilance, denial, and withdrawal. So all of these different manifestations of what it is we are experiencing on a regular basis. And I want to let people know that it is not the same thing as PTSD, because a lot of people try to compare racial battle fatigue and PTSD. The difference is that when you think about PTSD, you are reliving a past traumatic event. When it comes to racial battle fatigue, this is something we are continuing to deal with. So we, as a Black community, which is the work I do specifically, we don't get time to even heal from the previous microaggression or macroaggression before we're being constantly attacked again. So it is not the same thing as PTSD, and I definitely want to make that clear. In addition to the psychological consequences, there are also what's known as physiological consequences, right? So there are these physical manifestations in our bodies as a result of the racism that we are experiencing. Dr. Smith's work shows that some of these physiological consequences include tension headaches, elevated heart rates, upset stomach, high blood pressure, ulcers, and a loss of appetite, among a plethora of other physiological consequences. With the study I did with the Black graduate women, there was one participant in the study who shared that she would throw up every morning, but only on the days where she knew she had to go to campus. Because for her, it literally made her sick. Because like I said before, she, the whole struggling with anxiety of knowing that something's going to happen that day. So the anxiety just physically made her sick every single morning, but only on the days where she knew that she had to go to campus. And I know for me, as someone who dealt with racial battle fatigue a lot during my doctoral program, I know what it was like to feel sick. And I think for me, it was hard in the moment, even as someone who researched racial battle fatigue, to understand that I was suffering from that. But I ended up in the hospital twice because of what it was doing to my physical body. And I didn't realize it until my body literally broke down because of the anxiety and the racial microaggressions and just how debilitating experiencing racism is that I feel like people don't understand, which is why I do the work that I do now, so people can understand whether you intend to microaggress or whether you know that it's happening. It doesn't detract from the fact that our students are still experiencing both psychological and physiological consequences of what is happening to them. Any questions or comments before I continue? Sure, we're good on time. Okay. Okay, so I am going to share the actual study that I did. So I did two different ones. So first study I did, I looked at first year Black women at George Washington University to see how they respond to microaggressions. Then for my dissertation, I switched from first year students to graduate students to see how they respond to and cope with gendered racial microaggressions, just because I wanted to see, does the way we experience, respond, and cope, let's say 18 years old, change when we're 30 or 35? There were 11 women in the study. I did 3 different methods of data collection. So I started with focus groups with the women. Then they journaled for 30 days. Because most of the research says that one of the gaps when it comes to racial microaggressions is not necessarily knowing exactly how we feel in that moment, and then struggling with memory recall afterwards, especially when something happens to you so often, it is easy for you to forget. So I had the women journal for 30 days to talk about what was happening to them every day. And then after that, I did individual interviews with them to kind of go over some of the things that they talked about in their journal entries. So the research question specifically was, how do Black women respond to the microaggressions? I came up with three main themes. They respond externally, internally, or emotionally. So the external responses were those times when the women actually responded in the moment, verbally to the person who was aggressing them in the moment, when they were challenging the person, whether it was a student or a faculty member. This was the least common out of the 3 types of responses. The second type was internally, and this refers to this internal conversation that we have where we're negotiating if and how to respond in that moment, where we're trying to make sense of what's happening. Oftentimes that conversation sounds something like, did they really just say that? Did they mean it the way I think they meant it? Were they being racist? What's going to happen if I respond right now? Am I going to get in trouble as a student for correcting the professor or the other students? Like, just all of these things that we're trying to negotiate in our heads, because we know what it's like to just be us in that space. So a lot of the women said that they don't even respond at all out of fear of consequences by a professor, fear of no one else having their back. So for example, if they're the only Black student in a class full of white students, if they bring up the racial implications of what's said, will people believe them? Will they be portrayed as the angry Black woman, which is a negative stereotype often placed upon Black women? And one of the quotes I'll share in a couple of minutes will show that. So just this internal dialogue that they're constantly having with themselves to see if they should respond, and we're just trying to make sense of something that doesn't make sense in the first place. And then they have emotional responses, which is going to be the focus of the ones that I share with you today. Just the psychological responses and the emotional responses that they have as a result of experiencing these microaggressions on a regular basis. Okay, so this first quote from one of the participants says, it's very tiring. I think I just sometimes have a mentality, to be honest, of I give up. Like, this is just how it is. Nothing I say is going to matter. I've always felt like, as a Black woman, I'm at the bottom of the totem pole. And then to have these things that happen to you every single day that reinforce it, it's just exhausting. So so she's one of the participants, and this came out during her individual interview. And I did 11 individual interviews, and I would say at least half of them use the exact phrase, we're at the bottom of the totem pole. Every single one believes that, especially as a Black woman. So just the importance of intersectionality, right? So yes, as Black women, we're going to have experiences that mirror those of Black men because we're both Black, but there are going to be things that are specific to us because we're Black women, and things that are specific to them as Black men. But just this double marginalized identity for a lot of the Black women, believing like we're at the bottom, and having to go into spaces every single day that just reaffirm how people feel about you or how much they don't value you. Just how that for this participant made her feel like she wanted to give up because she feels like nothing she does is ever going to change that. And I feel like that is where we as professors have to do better. Right? We have to create spaces that affirm who our students are. We have to create spaces that students know that if someone does say something, they're going to have a professor that is going to step in, right? So we, as people of color who are dealing with these in classroom, when I was a student, like I shouldn't even have to be negotiating how to respond in class when the professor should be the one taking care of that for me, right? So like, what does that look like for us as professors? To one, create an environment where people know that that type of behavior isn't going to be tolerated, but then also to know how to actually respond to students in that, in those type of situations. And that'll kind of be the focus of the next workshop in 2 weeks. This next quote here, she says, I really don't know how to make it pretty on the plate, but I just don't like being here. And it's like, how do other people like it here? Like, seriously, how? And people will say, find pockets of joy. My pockets are empty. It's just lint. I feel like I'm waking up every day thinking, is this how I want to spend my life? But what are my other options? And again, back to the sadness. Honestly, if they did a statistic here, I feel like 90% of the Black women on this campus probably have depression. When she said her pockets were empty and it was just lint, like I had to fight back tears, just seeing how broken she was in that moment, to see how helpless and hopeless she felt, really broke my heart. And then I think especially when she's talking about, is this how I want to spend my life? But what are my other options? So just feeling stuck as well, right? So instead of being able to be proud that she is a graduate student and pursuing higher education, her feeling like I'm here because I feel like I have to be. And she talks about this throughout the interview, just wanting to make her family proud and being here for them and feeling like she can't give up because of that, but then also feeling like, do I have to continue to endure these racially hostile environments in order to make my family proud? So just how much of a struggle that was for her, and her believing that at least 90% of the women here, the women at the institution, Black women specifically, would probably have some form of the depression. And based on the women that I interviewed, both for the study with the first year students as well as the graduate students, I would say that she is correct in terms of them having symptoms that are common with depression. This next quote, she says, Like I said earlier, one of the reasons why Black women don't respond to racial microaggressions is fear of perpetuating what's known as the angry Black woman stereotype, which is a stereotype that tries to portray Black women as aggressive or sassy or angry. So these next two quotes will show the silencing impact or effect of racial microaggressions. So for this one, I had asked the participant if she ever gets accused of being the angry Black woman, and she said no, which isn't common, because almost every other woman says that she does. So when I asked her, why do you think you don't get accused of that, she responded and said, and so I feel like I don't get the angry Black woman stereotype literally because I just kind of get quiet and I shut down. I don't really have much to say about anything. Like, what's your opinion? I don't have one. I don't have one. So for her, she feels like her classmates or her professor never comes at her or accuses her of being an angry Black woman because she just literally just will not speak up. In class, if they ask her if she has an opinion, she'll just say no, even though, and for me, it was frustrating because outside of class, she is vibrant and brilliant and has so much to contribute, but her classmates don't know that, and she silences herself because of fear of perpetuating this stereotype that just doesn't really apply to her. So, and for her and for many of the other participants, the number one reason why they don't respond in the moment is because they don't want to be accused of being the angry Black woman.
Can I interrupt you for a second, ask a question?
Of course.
So I've seen that in my own classes with my students of color, and they just get quiet and they kind of shut down. And I don't know what to do. Like, do I continue to try and draw them into the conversation, or do I respect their space and their need to be quiet? I guess I just don't know how to handle it in the moment. Do you have any suggestions?
Yes. So for me, I think that's a great question. I think for me, when I think about being a student in those moments, I was always comfortable in classes where the white professor created that safe environment in the beginning, right? So for example, one of my favorite professors who ended up being my dissertation chair, I love that she'll bring up race before I even have to, right? So oftentimes I think when I'm thinking about the racial implications of something, I'm afraid to say them because I don't know how it's going to be received. But if I'm in someone's classroom that I know is intentional about bringing up these things, who is intentional about interrogating things from a racial lens, it makes me feel like I'm safe enough to also talk about those things. I also feel safe when I've experienced racial microaggressions and I've seen the professor handle it in the moment. So then I know that if I say something that someone doesn't like and they're going to come at me sideways, that professor is going to handle it, right? So I feel like we as professors have to model those behaviors to make our students, well, we can't make people do anything, but to allow our students to feel safer to speak up in those spaces.
Can I ask actually a second part question off of Rachel's question? So because I have a unique position in my interactions with students because I work in university development, I work for advancement. So a lot of times I'm having conversations with students of color that are more friendships and like one-on-one where they're, sharing their feelings with me. Sometimes I'm at a loss of what to say as well. A lot of times I will say, obviously, I've never experienced the things that you're experiencing. I hear you, I see you, I empathize. But is there anything else that I can say in order to, make them feel like I am a safe space and they can talk to me about anything that they need to?
I love the things that you're already doing. I think especially as a Black woman in a world where we often feel silenced or ignored, having someone say, I see you and hear you means a lot to us. I also think it's important because the Black community is not a monolith and we don't all need and want the same thing. Like, it's okay to ask students, right? Like, what would make you feel more safe in this space? What would make you feel more thought of or centered or considered in this space, especially when it is a one-on-one relationship, because there are things that might work for me that might not work for my colleague, or there might be things that work for me this week that might not work for me in 2 months based on where I am in the moment. And I think if you're consistent about trying to build a relationship with students, I feel like it comes off more genuine and they're more likely to respond. However, if a white professor just all of a sudden comes out of no, so for example, with the whole, everything that's been happening with all the racial trauma that we are experiencing, there are some people that will reach out in a way that feels genuine. And we know it's genuine because these people have always tried to have our back or have always been there, versus those that we can tell, like, you're just doing it because it's a checklist and someone told you, oh, make sure you check on your Black students, but you're not doing it in a way that is genuine, which is why I think it's important to make sure that we are maintaining relationships with students, we're building relationships and trying to keep them, versus just trying to do things because it's a check mark. I don't believe in performative allyship, and students can read that from a mile away. So I think it's important to make sure, one, that you're going in with the best of intentions, and that you're really making it about making the student feel seen and heard, not because you want to feel good about yourself. And not saying that's what you like, that's what you're doing, but that's just some of the pushback I've seen from students in the past is from teachers or faculty members that they feel like aren't being genuine in their attempts to connect with them, but you seem to not be one of those people. So thank you for that.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions?
Can I just ask kind of a question about, in your study, do you know whether or not the women that you were interviewing, whether or not they knew one another, or whether or not there was like the sense of community of those women, and whether or not you think that that sort of environment is helpful, or it could potentially be almost like carrying other people's sort of burdens, right? Like having all these, being constantly reminded that your institution or whatever has all these different issues with it from every single person that you speak with. So I guess they probably sort of get that intuition anyways, but I didn't know if you sort of could speak to that.
Yeah, sure. I think that's a great question. So out of the 11, 3 of them knew each other because they were in a program together, but the other ones did not. So like I said, I did 3 different methods: the focus group, the journaling, and the individual interview. And I was intentional about doing the focus group first because I wanted to create a sense of community with them. Also, when it comes to racial microaggressions, a lot of women think that they're the only ones dealing with it, right? So in every focus group I did, both with the undergraduates and the graduate students, I heard some form of, oh, so it's not just me. Oh, so I'm not crazy, right? So being in the focus group and being with each other helped to reaffirm what it is they were going through and made them feel less crazy, their words. And I think for me, I also wanted to build community in sense of, like, I never want any study I do just be about me collecting data. I wanted them to get to know each other, right? So that way they outside of the study can hang out with each other and support each other and do those things as well. So for me, doing the focus group first was intentional and important to help contribute to them in that way. And then in terms of that second part of your question, I remember asking something similar during the individual interview, like just being afraid. So like, especially because I had them journal, like, am I re-traumatizing you, right? Because you were like, not only are you writing about these things, now I'm then asking you about these things, because one of them had told me that she doesn't normally think about it, because one of the ways they cope is to avoid places, to avoid thinking about it, to normalize their experiences and things of that nature. So I asked them, like, am I making it worse for you by asking you to participate in this study? And she was like, Angel, honestly, no, because no one's ever asked me about these things. Like, nobody cares about my experiences. So she was like, yes, it hurts to deal with it, but at least I'm getting to deal with it now because no one else had asked. But I was afraid. So I'm like, yes, I want this information because I want their stories to be told, but not if it's going to add trauma to people who are already being traumatized. So thank you for that question. How are we on time? Okay, I think we're okay. Okay. I think I have one more clip, maybe. Okay, there we go. This is the last one. She says, and I got wounds, and I just got open wounds and it's not going anywhere and it's not healing up either. And that's what I feel about that situation. It was just, I wish I was more vocal, and I wish I did become angry. And I feel like in those moments, I will end up regretting it. Probably when I go home, like, why did I do that? So for this participant, and this was something else that I saw in terms of their emotional responses, a lot of the women felt regret or guilt or shame for not responding in the moment. So now, granted, they didn't respond in the moment because they were protecting themselves, which makes complete sense, but then they would still go home and beat themselves up because they didn't. I remember one of the participants, she was on a bus and she was being mocked. She was speaking in her native language. And she was being mocked on the bus because of it. And she didn't say anything to the boys who did it. And then when she got home, when she was talking to me about it, she was like, I know my dad would have been so ashamed of me for not sticking up for myself or for our language or for our culture. And like that broke my heart, right? So not only are they struggling in the moment, but then they're having this additional trauma because they feel like they didn't respond the way they should have. Okay, so I am going to share a counter story. So for those of you who are not familiar, my work is rooted in critical race theory, which acknowledges and puts at the forefront the impacts and implications of race and racism on the experiences of Black and Brown folks. And one of the methodologies that is crucial to CRT is called counter storytelling, where we're pushing back on dominant narratives and we're telling the stories of participants in their own way. So the way I created this counter story, I did it as a letter, and it is basically a way for the participants to respond to their attackers. So based on the 3 themes in my study, I created one letter for each responding to their attackers. So the letter that I'm going to read to you today, the actual incident that is described in the letter was shared by one of the participants, and then all of the other things in the letter were taken from other things that the participants shared during the focus groups. Here it goes. Dear John, I woke up this morning in a great mood. I spent the last week studying for a bio test and I just knew I was going to ace it. But just in case, for some extra good luck and a touch of home, I decided to wear the headdress my mom sent me from Ghana. She made it for me by hand, and when I wear it, I feel like a boss. I put it on and I'm reminded of those who came before me and sacrificed so much for me to be where I am today. Wearing it makes me feel grateful and proud. So when I walked into class today, that's exactly how I felt. In my head, I could hear my mother's voice whispering, "You got this," over and over again. And she was right, I did. But as I walked by your desk, her voice was suddenly drowned out by the sounds of you and your friends laughing at me and singing one of the songs from the Lion King soundtrack. In that moment, I went from proud and grateful to broken and defeated. Although you never said an actual word to me, let me tell you what your actions said. They said that I am laughable. My existence, my race, and my culture are all a joke to you. They said that I am beneath you, because why else would you feel so comfortable publicly disrespecting me? They also said that you're untouchable. You knew that you could belittle me in a room full of people with little to no fear of consequences. You wanted a few laughs and you got them. But what you didn't get was a rise out of me. You wanted me to react, but I refused to give you the satisfaction. And let me tell you why. First, I had better things to do, like ace that test. I didn't have the time nor the extra energy to let you get to me when I needed to keep my head in the game. If I stopped to address every racist comment hurled at me by some ignorant white person, I wouldn't be where I am today. I'd be too busy fighting. And while we're on the topic of fighting, that leads me to reason number 2 as to why I didn't say anything. I refuse to play into the angry Black woman stereotype that white people slap onto Black women who dare to express their feelings on a situation. Did I have the right to be angry with you? Absolutely. Do I have the privilege of being visibly angry with you? Absolutely not. As a Black woman in a predominantly white space, I'm in a constant game of chess that requires me to think 3 moves ahead of my opponents. Let's say I did respond to you and your friends in class. What do you think would have happened? If an argument had ensued, whose side would the class full of white students have taken? What about the white professor? Who would he have believed? Notice I didn't ask which one of us would have been right because we both know that doesn't matter. There are graves full of Black and brown bodies that demonstrate that. So no, John, I couldn't give you the satisfaction of a response because it's one of the many privileges I do not have. So instead, I chose to ignore your need for attention, sit down and concentrate on my tests. And since you're such a big fan of The Lion King, I decided to focus on a different scene in the movie. Your voice has now been replaced with Mufasa's. He says, "Look inside yourself, Maya. You are more than you've become. You must take your place in the circle of life. Remember who you are." Thanks for the reminder, John. I almost forgot. With gratitude, Maya. Okay, so the purpose of this letter was a couple of things. One, because the main way Black women respond to microaggressions is by not responding at all. I wanted to create a way for them to actually have their voices heard. So a lot of what I wrote in the letter was a result of me asking them, okay, what would you say if you could say something to the people that microaggress you? What are some of the reasons that you choose not to respond, right? So that letter was kind of explaining that. So the actual thing that happened, one of the participants talked about it, right? She's African. She had her African head wrap on, and as she was walking by a group of white boys, they just started singing the song from The Lion King. And as she's telling me the story, like she's hysterically crying, but she was very adamant. She was like, I did not cry in that moment because I didn't want them to know how much they were getting to me. Right. But then if we think about it, in that moment, that might be something small or insignificant, but to her, that was powerful for her. Right. But then she's still expected to then sit down and take her test as if nothing happened. Right. So just being mindful of these, what seem like small, insignificant acts have really dire consequences on the mental, emotional, and spiritual well-being of our students. Any questions about the letter or the study? I guess either study, because I've kind of gone back and forth between both studies. I see a hand up. Hi. You're on mute.
Sorry, yes. The counter story was very powerful, and I appreciate you sharing that. As a Latina, I can relate to a lot of what you mentioned about microaggressions and situations just like the one in that classroom. So my question to you, because that's your area of expertise, and have any studies been done with Latinos and similar, right? I know they apply to people of color, but I think that often institutions of higher ed, when they think of people of color, they think about Black and they forget about the Latinos and the Puerto Ricans and the Dominicans. And so my question is there any research out there that provides kind of information on those groups in particular?
Yes, absolutely. I am a proud Puerto Rican woman, so I definitely support the fact that it is different. So yes, so Dr. Daniel Solorzano out of California does a lot of work on microaggressions in general, but specifically on the Latinx community. My next study, I'm actually going to be looking specifically at Afro-Latinas and what our experiences are specifically, because yes, as Black women, there are some overlaps, but the Latinidad part, I think, adds some nuances to our experiences. But to answer your question, yes, there is literature currently on the experiences of Latinos when it comes to both microaggressions and racial battle fatigue.
Okay, thank you. And I am Puerto Rican and I was born in Brooklyn. So
look at that. I love it. Thank you for your question. Any other questions, y'all? Okay, I'm going to switch to some of the recommendations. So I'm going to go back to sharing. Okay, so I am very participant focused, student centered, all that good stuff. So these recommendations I'm giving you are supported by literature, but they're coming directly from the participants. I specifically asked them, what could the university do to make you feel more supported? What would help you have a greater sense of belonging? So all of these come from them. When I think about recommendations, I think about them in two different categories. So I think there's the institutional and then the student-centered, right? So the institutional are the things like, as an institution, we need to change, whether it's practices, policies, things of that nature. But then there are also going to be things that our students need right now today, right? So it's going to take time to change the system, but then there are going to be things that our students need us to do ASAP. So from an institutional standpoint, all of the participants talked about the importance of anti-racist education, which is why we're doing this workshop now. And then we'll have the specific workshop next week where I give you some more specific practices. And all of them talked about increase in diversity, both in the number of students of color as well as the number of faculty of color. A lot of the students said that they often didn't respond to microaggressions because they felt like nobody in the room would have their back because they don't see people that look like them. Also, it's easier for students to buy into the negative narratives that they're told when they don't have any examples of the opposite, right? So one of my master's students told me that I'm the first Black professor. She's a Black teacher like anybody. So like she had no Black women in K-12 in her undergraduate degree. And I think she got me in her second year of her master's program, right? So for her, her thing was like, now I know that I can be a professor if I want to be, but she had never seen it before, right? So being able to help counter some of these negative narratives that our students are being told by having them see people that look like them, I think is incredibly important. From a student-centered perspective, counter spaces is really important. So people talk about safe spaces, but counter spaces being more active in terms of what are we teaching our students? How are we providing them with the tools that they need to negotiate racially hostile environments, right? So like, yes, we need to change the racially hostile environments, but right now, these are the environments they're living in and they have to occupy. How do we teach them how to navigate it, right? So even when it comes to microaggressions, how should our students respond? What should that look like? What can that look like for them? So having those conversations, I think, is really important, especially when it comes to undergrads. They often have never heard of what a microaggression is. They experience them all the time, but don't have the language for it. Also, when it comes to racial battle fatigue, almost every time I teach a person of color what racial battle fatigue is, there's always this like, oh, that's what it's called. That's what I've been experiencing, right? So just the power of being able to name what is happening to you is very important to these students. And then finally, the importance of having culturally competent counselors. So as you've noticed throughout this presentation, I've talked about what those psychological consequences are of their experiences. So they need to be able to go to a counselor on campus that's going to understand what the symptoms of racial battle fatigue are, that are going to understand the racial implications of what it is they're experiencing. Because I know both myself when I was a student and some of the participants have talked about that when they have gone to get help, which, you know, is already hard enough to convince people to get help for mental health because of the stigmas that are attached to it. But they're in those spaces talking about their experiences with racism on campus, and their feelings have either been invalidated or dismissed, or they've been told that, you know, they're over exaggerating or being too sensitive. So not only did the student have to deal with the trauma of the experience, now they're being re-traumatized because their feelings are being invalidated. So it's important that we have counselors, of course, counselors of color, but also counselors that understand what RBF is, what the psychological consequences of racism and gendered racism and those things are. And we're good. All right, I will open up the floor. You are welcome to ask me anything. TC, is that a hand up, I think?
So, hello, hi.
Hi.
My name is my name is Tanyetta. I work in the social work department. I teach in that department. So I just wanted to bring up, because my daughter actually attends that university and she's in the nursing program, and she's struggling. She is one of the very few Blacks in her classes, and one of the things I had a conversation with her with is to advocate for herself when it's time for her to do the clinicals, that she's with someone that looks like her, that she's going to have the kind of conversations. And here I am as an educated woman already talking to my daughter about some of the experiences she may have and how to deal with that. So right now she's going into her sophomore year. She starts her clinicals, and I want her advisor to be open that she needs someone to look like her when she's going into clinicals, because she's not experiencing that on campus, and hopefully that that can happen in some form or fashion there. But I also want to touch on, just yesterday, I've received an email from a community member who we had some issues on campus about our police cadet program and about graduation. And I received an email and it says, "Are you the woke professor that got the city going crazy about the police cadets graduation?" I didn't say anything. Just like you said, I was like, isn't that something? Had nothing to do with it. And it was a joke and it was unintentional, but I didn't respond to that, you know? And I know they didn't mean anything by it, but it was like, why me? Why did you say that to me? And obviously it's a hot topic that's taking place at that university. It's on social media about what's going on. And I'm not even that familiar with it, but immediately someone just pointed out that, am I the one that's causing problems at NU? So that's something, when you said that, I'm like, oh, and you just like, you got to pick your battles.
Yeah, you absolutely do. And I think I had a white advisor at Syracuse, and I adored her. And I would tell her the, things that were happening on campus. And she was like, Angel, I don't understand why you don't respond every time. And I was like, because I don't have the time to. Like, I literally would have no time to do anything else if I was constantly responding. Like, I was walking across the street one day, going to work on campus. A white man pulled up in front of me, rolled his window down, called me the N-word, and kept on driving. Like, I literally don't have the time or energy to deal with it on a regular basis. So you have to pick and choose. Like, but to me, like with that guy, like if you're bold enough to do that, what else are you bold enough to do to me?
Yeah.
Like, I don't want to deal with any of that. Right. So, but then after that, I had to go to work, right, and smile like nothing just happened. But yes, we absolutely have to pick and choose our battles, which is frustrating, right? So
Yeah.
I talk with students about what it looks like to pick and choose your battles, and to not to judge yourself or beat yourself up if you've chosen not to fight that battle that day. But I want them to not have battles to fight at all. Right. So we have the institutions, like I said, like we need to flip over some tables, y'all, because there's a lot of trash things that are happening, but there are also things that we need to help our babies with. I mean, I have doc students and they're still my babies. They're always going to be my babies, but like we need to make sure that we're taking care of our students at the core, in terms of like, it is okay if you don't respond. But thank you for sharing that. I appreciate you. Any other questions?
So the comment to make, Angel, thank you very much for sharing your experiences. I've gone through similar experiences myself, being a woman from Southeast Asia. Anyways, but also I think people get into a shell. They don't want to come out of that shell, because when you look around who there is and you find there is no support, either by the instructor or by the environment, what is it? It's just like a hermit crab. You just kind of crawl back into your shell and you don't want to come out of that shell because you feel attacked. And it is a lot of, I would say that a role as a teacher in a high school or elementary, or as our higher education instructor, you need to develop that atmosphere or environment of trust, where you will have those discussions where people will be able to share their experiences and talk about it and not be ridiculed. And that takes a lot of guts, and talk about some topics which talk about race as well. People need to know that, how other people feel with your microaggressions. What is it all about? When we are putting everything under the rug, what it happens is it just seems like it's a normal behavior. So one side of the, let's say, a community of people of color or different backgrounds just feel attacked constantly. We need to break those barriers. And it does take a lot of courage from a lot of people. So I think that we need to advocate. We need to take charge as an instructor to talk about these things, how you're feeling.
Yes, I completely agree with that. I want to talk a little bit about this in the next session, but just the importance of having those conversations, right? And I don't remember who was asking me about how to create that space for your students in the classroom. But I think for me, when I talked about that white professor that I think made me feel safe, I don't remember who had been shot at the time, which is frustrating because it happens so often in our community. But she brought it up in class before we even started anything. She was like, well, this happened over the weekend. Let's talk about what that means. How are you feeling about it? And it was the first time I had ever had a white professor bring up the death of a Black person as like, okay, like, let's, like, I'm acknowledging that this horrible thing happened. Like, let's create space to talk about that. And so that I was just like, oh, like, she really is about that life. Like she's not just putting on, like, this is really something that she cares about. And so for me as a professor, I'm very intentional about doing the same thing, right? So when the 6 Asian women were murdered, we talked about that in my classroom with the Derek Chauvin verdict. We talked about that. Like, I'm always going to create space for my students. And I will admit, as a woman of color, I need space too. But I'm also a professor, right? So even I remember emailing them after the Adam Toledo one, I sent out an email to my students to like create a space, like, hey, let's talk about all the things that Dante Wright had happened like in the last couple of weeks. And I was literally crying as I was writing the email, because I'm like, I know I need to do this, but because like, I know I'm at an institution where no one else is going to do it if I don't do it. And I'm an educator, so it needs to be done, but I'm crying because I'm literally still broken and like oozing myself. Like it's intense, right? So we need people that are going to acknowledge that this stuff is hard, right? And we are hurting as a community. And I don't care what subject you teach. It does not matter if their kids are broken and can't even focus on that, right? So I'm always going to talk about that and make sure that that's at the forefront. But I get it that this isn't something that you're just born knowing how to do. Like, yes, as educators, it's our job to have these conversations, but if you've never been taught to have the conversations, like I get why you're not having the conversations, right? Which is why workshops like these are so important. For example, I had a white student in my master's class, and I teach in the student affairs department, and he said, I don't feel comfortable talking about race. And I was like, well, you better get comfortable, because no future educator is leaving my classroom without feeling comfortable, right? And I'm really big, like I don't call people out, I call them higher, right? So I create spaces where students can feel comfortable to have these conversations. The following semester, something racist had happened on campus. I don't remember what happened, but he sent me an email and was like, hey, Dr. Jones, I know that the Black community is really struggling now, and you're a Black woman. I'm sure no one's checking on you. So if you want to meet up for coffee to talk about it, let's meet. And I'm like, last semester, he didn't even feel comfortable talking about race. Now he's acknowledging that the Black community is hurting. He's reaching out to a professor. He wants to, and I was like, yes, like this is why we do the work. But so like, I wasn't mad at him that he wasn't comfortable talking about race. Like, I get it, because if you're not taught how to have these conversations, I think it's unfair to expect people to do them. It doesn't take you off the hook, because you should be learning how to have these conversations, right? Because the conversations still need to be had. But I don't ever want educators to feel less than or inferior because they don't wake up knowing how to have conversations about race. Like, you have to learn and practice, and you're going to fall on your face. I fall on my face. Like I am not perfect, right? Like I fall on my face all the time. But our kids deserve for us to keep on getting up and trying again. Okay, any other questions before we wrap up? All right, well, thank you. I really appreciate y'all.
Dr. Jones, this was fantastic. So thank you so much for taking the time. We look forward to having you back for round 2. And so much of what you discussed today can be applied not only in the classroom, but in the workplace, in our everyday lives. And one of the common themes that I think our committee would all agree is knowing how to have these conversations. And that's why people need to continue to be part of these discussions and workshops. So thank you so much. This is being recorded, so we will follow up with a survey to everyone here today. And we will also send out a link to the recording of the presentation. So thank you all for joining us. Everybody have a fantastic weekend.
Thanks, y'all. Bye.